On the 15th of August 1944, the enemy succeeded in landing 3 American infantry divisions and an Allied airborne task force in southern France. The weak German units didn't have much to oppose them, and they were already badly decimated by the heavy fire from the Allied naval guns and by air attacks. The invading Allied units pushed forward in 3 directions. The strongest advance went towards Toulon and Marseille to secure those 2 ports for subsequent use. The second group moved through Provence toward Grenoble, where no resistance at all was to be expected. The third finally headed for Nice, but it encountered heavy resistance near the French-Italian border and came to a halt. The American and French were supported everywhere by the French resistance movement. 24,000 resistance fighters were said to be in action at that time. In my experience, these guerrillas only appeared where and when they could do so without great risk to themselves. Typically, they would liquidate small German rear guards or scattered groups, and then mostly from ambush. Even then, the German OKW allowed them the status of combatants if they complied with 2 conditions: to come forward as an integral military unit and to wear clearly visible armbands to identify themselves. Nevertheless, the French guerrillas would always avoid open confrontation. Instead, disguised as civilians and without any distinguishing mark, they would lurk in the shadows, waiting for a chance to strike in some clandestine way. During the battles of retreat up the Rhône, German soldiers disappeared again and again without a trace. The most common victims of French resistance included lone messengers or communications people who were sent out in small parties to repair cables. I remember one such case very clearly. I had sent a motorcycle messenger with a companion to the regimental command post. They had to drive through a small forest en route, but after a short while they returned without having reached their destination. They were fired on by civilians in the woods, and one of them received a bullet wound in his thigh. Half an hour or so later, a young Frenchman walked by the isolated house that was my command post. First, we did not pay any attention to him, but then our motorcycle messenger jumped up and yelled, "Well, there is one of those brothers." Shortly after, the young man stood before me, pale as death, probably suspecting what was coming. When he was searched, we found a heavy American Colt automatic pistol, a hand grenade, and finally the white armband with the Cross of Lorraine insignia of the Forces Françaises de l'Intérieur, FFI. During his interrogation, he admitted shooting at Germans in the nearby wood within the last half hour. When captured, his mission had been to assess our strength here, because his group wanted to finish us in the evening. Clearly, by posing as a civilian and concealing his membership in an organized military group, he forfeited the protection due a combatant. A court-martial immediately awarded him the death sentence, and he was executed by firing squad shortly thereafter. All in all, the French resistance was loath to expose themselves to a great amount of danger in battle, and did not earn too much admiration from us. Before the Americans and French landed in southern France, our regiment had already been moved to the area around the port city of Sète, presumably because our high command expected the Allied landings to take place in that vicinity. After the successful landing, we were pulled out and bussed eastward. We crossed the Rhône near Aries at least to slow down the advance of the Americans toward Toulon and Marseille. The division staff moved on to Aix-en-Provence. We were deployed for now in the areas to the southeast of it. The bridges across the Rhône had already been destroyed up to the north of Avignon before the landing, mostly by Allied air raids. The 2 most battle-worthy German units, the 11th Panzer Division and the 198th Infantry Division, stood exactly on the wrong side of the Rhône, which may show, intentionally or not, what little effect the German defence had. There existed the danger for all rear echelon units in southern France and in Army Group G to become cut off from the Burgundian Gate due to the forthcoming collapse of Army Group B in northern France. But nothing that I knew of at least was done to move out all unnecessary dead weight before the start of the battles in the area of the 19th Army. The only good road along the east bank of the Rhône was, therefore, totally blocked by retreating rear echelon units. As commander of the 19th Army, I would not have worried about the rear echelon units' activities unless they were urgently needed to bring supplies to the front. I would have ordered them to get out of the way, to allow freedom of movement to the combat troops. Trying to stop the advance of the Americans and the Allied French units towards Toulon and Marseille ended in failure. Grenadier Regiment 305 fought only 1 or 2 days against the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division. Our Grenadier Regiment 308 and the 198th Infantry Division's Fusilier Battalion were fighting further north in the area of the small Durance River against the U.S. 45th Infantry Division. Because the capacity of bridges and ferries was not sufficient, Grenadier Regiment 326 did not even cross the Rhône to get into the fight. Astonishingly, withdrawal to the Voges was permitted by the highest commander-in-chief on the 18th of August. During the period 20, the 22nd of August, Toulon and Marseille were already encircled by the enemy, who, on the 23rd of August, reached Grenoble without encountering any resistance during the advance. The danger of the 19th Army becoming cut off so far south was colossal. North of Montelimar, the wooded foothills of the French Alps reached directly into the Rhône Valley. Here, and some 20 kilometres further north near the River Drôme, the opponent pushed forward to the Rhône. I probably was not the only one who could not understand why the 19th Army was capricious enough to move its only 2 valuable divisions painstakingly to the east bank of the Rhône. There was no doubt that these would not have any chance against the overwhelming opponent, and therefore, 3 days later, we had to be pulled back northbound in forced marches. Toulon and Marseille fell on the 28th of August, with great loss of men and material to our side. But by the 25th of August, after a tremendous forced march, the 11th Panzer Division and our 198th Infantry Division already stood in readiness east of Montelimar to force out the Americans from their commanding position at the entrance to the Rhône Valley. Our attack failed, foiled by strong American artillery fire. My regiment fought near Sauzet, and our neighbour to the right, Grenadier Regiment 326, fought at Bonlieu at the Roubion River. Grenadier Regiment 305 secured the south from the enemy advancing in our direction. It is interesting to consider an American report from this battle, cited by Grazer. The Germans attacked the lines of the 36th Division along the Roubion at their weakest point, Bonlieu, and thrashed the combat engineers there. This attack also split the 141st and 142nd Infantry Regiments. Attempts by the 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry Regiment and Task Force Butler to close off Route Nationale 7 near La Concorde failed since the 141st Infantry Regiment is under constant pressure and is not capable of achieving control of the hills north and northeast of Montelimar. Reinforcements will be moved toward Crest on the Drôme. Artillery and airstrikes will support the troops in blocking the enemy's withdrawal up the Rhône. As a directly involved battalion commander and eyewitness, I must say that this announcement by the American commander remains incomprehensible to me to this day. Who could have, on the 25th of August, imposed such great pressure upon the 141st Infantry Regiment, situated exactly opposite from me? Me, with my roughly 100 men fit for combat? I agree only with the last sentence of the report. American artillery and a few dozen Jabos inflicted indeed disastrous losses on the retreating German supply columns and rearward units. In my opinion, all the Americans would have had to do was to climb down from their secure heights above the Rhône north of Montelimar into the valley and to fight. They could have bagged us all. Thank heaven that our opponents there were not Russians. I do not believe that there were noteworthy enemy forces in place at the west bank of the Rhône, other than elements of the Maquis. Even these guerrilla forces, however, would not have been a problem for 2 divisions, 11th Panzer and our 198th Infantry, to brush aside or move around them in an orderly manner. To this day, I still don't know why we crossed over to the east bank of the Rhône. The success of the Allied landings in Normandy proved that Rommel's concept of defending at the beaches was not necessarily the most prudent. The opponent succeeded with the landing in spite of strong fortifications, large-scale laying of mines, and beach obstacles of all sorts, albeit with considerable losses. With our experiences from the Maginot Line in 1940, we should have known better about the value of fortifications, yet the defensive conditions on the Mediterranean coast could never be realistically compared with those on the Atlantic. There was nothing set up behind the weak coastal defence at the Mediterranean. It was obvious that this line of defence would be overrun in the first attack, so why should one expose it right there to certain destruction? As things developed in northern France, the defence of southern France became meaningless in a short time anyway. After barely 14 days, this was the result of the defensive actions of the 19th Army versus the Allied landing in southern France. The coastal defence east of the Rhône was wiped out within a few hours. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. Once more, tremendous amounts of irreplaceable material, such as arms and vehicles, were lost. Both so-called strongholds, Toulon and Marseille, were finished. Two good battle-capable divisions were decimated, mainly for the purpose of securing the delayed flight to the homeland for rear echelon units, which actually succeeded only with limitations in any case. If, at the time of the advance of the Allied landing fleet, we would have pulled back from the coast every battle-worthy fighting unit, free of the dead weight of rear echelon units, and then deployed them out of reach of the devastating effect of the heavy naval artillery, we could have established a flexible posture for battle. The invading enemy would then have run into empty terrain and could later have been made to suffer considerable losses. But for the last years of the war, it was probably true what General Hans Kissel said about the potential of the German leadership in general. It seemed as if these people had completely resigned and forgotten everything they had mastered so well at the beginning of the war. Certainly at this point in time, there were few survivors of the first or even the second generation of fighting soldiers of the Wehrmacht. Because the bulk of the 11th Panzer Division was badly needed by the 19th Army to keep the Route Nationale 7 open north of Montelimar, on the 27th of August, our division stood alone as rearguard, fighting around Montelimar. By the 28th of August, we were compressed into an area that became smaller and smaller. It may be worthwhile to mention an event from the days of battle around Montelimar. Early on the morning of the 27th of August, my aide-de-camp, a recipient of the Oak Leaves to the Knight's Cross, Oberfeldwebel, later Lieutenant Christian Braun, volunteered, as always, with a few men for patrol. In Russia, he had perfected his personal recipe for taking prisoners by cutting field telephone wires in the enemy's rear and then waiting for the repair party to show up. When they arrived, all Braun and his companions had to do was to welcome them to German captivity. It worked every time. After less than an hour, he and his men came back with a whole platoon of American infantrymen, including 2 officers as prisoners. He told us that they were about to freshen up in the early morning hours in an isolated house. Braun had only to fire 2 rounds from his submachine gun into the front door and loudly bark commands to surrender. That was enough to convince the Americans to give up. The 2 young officers were especially surprised when they realized the simple trick that had bested them. In all, more than 30 American soldiers were captured by Braun and his small patrol. When the patrol returned with the prisoners, I offered cigarettes and a glass of wine to the 2 officers, which they declined, as they were probably taught during their training. They had their own cigarettes, and they may have assumed that we wanted to poison them with the wine. Or they may have simply been loath to partake of something which was not available to their men. They proved to be exemplary prisoners. They never left my side when we broke through to the north the next morning. Since I simply had no use for them, I gave them the choice to march a few hundred meters up the hill and return to their own people, but they refused the offer. "No, sir," they said, "we are prisoners now." All they asked for was quick transportation to more tranquil domains, a wish I could by no means fulfill. During the many attacks by their own J-boss, they ran in all directions, but afterwards I had all of them right back on my neck. Only a nation that, based upon its tremendous material superiority, is so sure in the end to have the war's outcome in their favor, can afford to go to war with fighters like these. Of course, there were different experiences with Americans on other occasions. On the morning of the 28th of August, I received the regimental order regarding the breakthrough to the north, planned for the early morning of the 29th. North of the Drôme River, the Rhône Valley widens again. Therefore, the most difficult part was to pass through the approximately 20 kilometers between Montelimar and that river. The order caused my battalion, with the support of some tanks, to advance through the high ground east of Route Nationale 7. The tanks would link up with me early in the morning. Right away, I raised concern, because in my opinion it made no sense to get involved in further fighting in the woods with the far better equipped Americans. What mattered was to reach the north bank of the Drôme, if possible, without any further losses. My oberst, accustomed to similar situations from Russia, just like me, shared my opinion but stated, "Grandjean, this is an order from the general, so you can't do anything about it. He wants to march out the same way." Then I said, "Herr Oberst, I'll wait and see how the situation looks tomorrow morning and act accordingly." With this, he agreed. I ordered my company commanders to keep the greatest possible distance from the enemy in the early morning of the next day and to assemble at my command post. Anyone who could not be there in time for any reason would have to get through on his own. The direction was known, and we would meet later north of the Drôme on Route Nationale 7. At the crack of dawn, everybody at my command post was ready to march off, hopefully without having to effect a fighting breakthrough, but waiting for the promised tanks as well as for the rest of their companies. Only part of my battalion was there at the determined time. The others were still involved in occasional skirmishes with the Americans. When the tanks still did not show up a half hour after the agreed-upon time, I ordered the elements present to form up and move out. Our route of march took us not through the mountains, as I had been directed to do, but directly along the bank of the Rhône, covered by high swamp grass and brush. I could imagine why the tanks did not appear. To deploy them on narrow mountain roads, through the woods with dense undergrowth on each side, where the enemy could lie in wait behind every bush, was especially dangerous for them. In late afternoon, after we had crossed the Drôme almost untouched, I was not surprised to learn that during his attempted breakout, my division commander and many of his staff were captured, and right on the course that was meant for me too. Much later, we laid our hands on an old American newspaper in which his capture was described in detail when a US soldier tried to get him out from behind a bush. He demanded to be taken prisoner by an officer. Of course, I could not judge if the US Army paper reported truthfully, but that he put great emphasis on good manners certainly sounded right. After all, this was the man who spent an entire evening toasting his subordinates at his own party. In the days immediately following Richter's departure, our ear, Oberstleutnant Freiherr von Fink, assumed command of the division. It was not easy for our 1st Battalion, nor for the 1st Battalion of Grenadier Regiment 326. In the course of the late morning hours, the latter took back Le Coucourde in heavy fighting and opened up the important road for our retreat. Hauptmann Dressel, who was killed in action later, was awarded the Knight's Cross for this. Now the remainder of the division could escape across the Drôme, suffering relatively small losses. The total losses for the division during the breakthrough were estimated to be close to 1,500, including our commanding general. On the 31st of August, the division went into position in a line of resistance on the river Isère. In Valence, we procured provisions from a huge warehouse owned by the Wehrmacht. The food we got there was of such good quality that we were only able to remember most of the items by name. Incidentally, the French civilian population was already waiting all around the depot for the last Germans to leave so that they could help themselves. As always, we left this building intact. On the 2nd of September, we marched in close formation through Lyon, 140 kilometers to the north. Thousands of French people lined up along the route of our withdrawal, but I personally did not notice any hostile demonstrations. North of Lyon, the retreat continued through the Saône Valley, and after more strenuous marches we formed a new line of defence, northeast of Chalon-sur-Saône, at the Doubs, the western tributary of the Saône. Oberst Otto Schiel, an older gentleman from the OKH, assumed command on the 3rd of September. He was an energetic man, the sort who makes a successful businessman. On the 1st of October, he was, as usual, promoted to General Major. Major I.G. Grauer became the new LA of the division, replacing Oberstleutnant Freiherr von Fink, who in the meantime had had a bad accident. The Americans followed us very carefully along the Rhône and in the Saône Valley. To the west, between the rivers and the Swiss border, where the Maquis practically rolled out the red carpet for them, the Americans moved, by their standards, quite quickly ahead, During this, they occasionally attempted to push from the French Jura into the Doubs Valley. My battalion marched further west through the world-famous wine town Beaune, known to me quite well from spring 1943. There I had a surprising encounter. We stopped for a short break in the centre of the town, and together with a few of my men, I sat down on the terrace of a restaurant for a glass of wine. When I was seen by the French waitress who was serving, she was so stunned that she almost dropped her tray. The pretty young woman had been the girlfriend of a comrade of mine in nearby Dijon in 1943, and both she and her sister had been guests in my apartment several times. I understood her terrifying situation right away. At this point, of course, nobody in her hometown could learn that she was the girlfriend of a German officer. As I was paying my bill, she whispered to me that her German friend had been killed in Russia. A former comrade of his from Dijon had recently informed her of this. Up to this time, when the German troops had to pull out of much of France, it was my experience that there had been more collaboration than resistance on the part of the average French citizen. There were in France, as well as in our country, before and after 1945, always disgruntled informers who, often for the most abject reasons, denounced their fellow citizens to their own officials or to the German occupation forces. This was one reason for collaboration. There were also numerous Frenchmen who despised communism and who perhaps foresaw what could happen to them if the Germans were defeated in the East. As far as the former lot are concerned, nobody was saddened by the fact that they later sometimes were punished, and even sentenced to death. For the second category, of course, harsh punishment was more than questionable. Perhaps their judges believed in having to restore France's honour by sentencing collaborators to death or long imprisonment. Some of these people were actually guilty of little more than establishing a passable relationship with the occupying forces. They may even have, out of honest conviction, approved of enduring relations with the Germans, but still have remained French patriots. France did lose the war with the Germans in 1940, but not its national honour. What was done to French girls was especially ugly. Indeed, it was most crude and heartless how French girls whose only crime was to fall in love with a German were treated by the French mob. Typically, their hair was shaved or closely cropped. Then they were humiliated and beaten as they were run out of their native villages or towns by a local mob, seething with hatred. For the Frenchmen who participated, this may have been an expression of primitive sexual jealousy and insulted arrogance. Evidently, one has to put up with the fact that any major upheaval brings the lower side to the surface. We too had most evil denunciations, and not only after 1945. Our division moved into its next position at the Doubs River. The front line of our corps ran from Chalon-sur-Saône to Dole and on to Besançon. By the 8th of September, the front had to be shortened because of numerous penetrations by American tanks. The next morning, the line of resistance lay along the Ognon, 5 to 20 kilometres northwest of Doubs. On 8 or the 9th of September, my colleague, Major Dr. Major, together with his adjutant, was wounded by tank fire and captured by the pursuing Americans. Later, when he returned to his hometown of Stuttgart, Major told me that he was brilliantly taken care of by the American nurses. Without penicillin, which at that time was not yet available to us, he would most likely not have survived his severe injury. During the days of fighting in the first half of September, I had 3 experiences that were most significant. One was quite successful, one questionable, and one a little unusual. I had positioned a few infantrymen equipped with Panzerfausts at a railroad underpass. It could have been on the line southwest of Dole. Suddenly, a jeep with 4 US soldiers came rolling along toward our underpass, clearly unaware of any danger. It stopped hardly 10 meters away, and the occupants prepared to dismount. 2 of my men had aimed their rocket launchers at the jeep already, when I whispered to them not to shoot at the vehicle, but beyond it. Seconds later, there were 2 terrible explosions, and our 4 Americans froze in place. When we called on them to surrender, they came marching forward with their hands up. Later, they said they believed our lines to be much further to the north. This was why they did not expect Panzerfaust fire from an ambush position, but rather perhaps artillery fire at the most. We took them and their jeep to my command post. The boss was a well-fed, red-headed major, apparently of Irish descent. He and his comrades were not as touchy as the two US lieutenants from Montelimar. Together we had a strong drink, and at that time I was even rich enough to offer a choice between whiskey or French cognac. "I prefer whiskey," the redhead said objectively. When we searched the vehicle, we found maps with the firing plans of the American artillery. Our major was no little fish, but obviously the artillery officer of the US division which opposed us. Of course, the American soldiers were allowed to keep anything that was personal property, but the maps were clearly a different story. Despite his entreaties to the contrary, I had to withhold them from him. Years later, I met him on the street in Bad Tolz. We exchanged a few casual words, but I had the impression that our short encounter was not especially pleasant for him. Besides, it was shortly after war's end. The event of questionable import was this. Later on, when we took some American prisoners, one of them asked to be able to speak to the German commanding officer. My English at that time was still somewhat bumpy, but it quickly became clear what concerned the GI. "Sir, I am Jewish," he told me. I responded that to me he was just an American prisoner of war. Besides, I was absolutely certain that no American prisoner of war would be sorted out in this respect. Anti-Semitism was not an issue for me. In my East Prussian homeland, my father did business with Jews when they showed up at our farm to buy animal pelts or scrap iron. My Aunt Helene worked for decades as a chief bookkeeper in a Danzig, Gdansk cigarette factory. Privately, she was also involved in a friendship with the Jewish owner of the firm and his family. Presumably, part of the Christmas gifts she brought each year came from the Borg family. My first wife was an apprentice in a Jewish-owned warehouse before we were married. The unusual experience of this time was of a different kind. I often saw how German 88mm flak, tanks, self-propelled assault guns, or anti-tank guns destroyed enemy tanks, and of course the other way around as well. This time, I was an eyewitness to playing the game in a way that was new to me. Immediately across from the position of our heavy infantry gun section, several American tanks suddenly appeared in the dense brush. The short-barreled 150mm guns were basically used only for high-angle fire. The surprised gun crews had to find means for their own protection, so they aimed directly at two enemy tanks and fired. I don't know if anything like this had been practiced before. The distance amounted surely to not much more than 50 meters. The effect was horrible. The two tanks that were hit literally exploded, while the others behind them shifted at once into reverse, as one could clearly hear. Unfortunately, those experiences of success became more and more scarce. Continuously fighting on the 15th of September, the division moved back to the western edge of the Voges mountains via Lure. To present an idea of what was left of people in the replenished division 1 month later, 1st Battalion of the Grenadier Regiment 308 consisted of only 22 men, including the 2 officers. One of the battalion commanders was seriously wounded and taken prisoner by the Americans. The second one was killed in action just 3 days later. The 3rd Battalion commander in a week, Hauptmann Bengel, a member of the division since the very first day of its formation, had only a few weeks left to live. On the 6th of October, during a counterattack, he was badly wounded and died shortly thereafter in a field hospital from an infection. It is simply impossible to detail all that took place in the battles between Chalon-sur-Saône and our later deployment west of Gerardmer. One incident that is particularly vivid in my mind took place near Lure. My soldiers brought in a seriously wounded comrade whose abdominal wall was completely ripped open by a shell splinter. Since we had to pull back, we considered dragging him along. We emptied the rear seats of my jeep and loaded him in. The poor guy was fully conscious and suffered unbearable pain. Since the larger part of the battalion had already marched off, our physician could not be reached. The moment we started to drive, the wounded soldier continuously screamed in pain, so we carefully took him out of the car and laid him on the ground. While we stood around rather helplessly, a young Frenchwoman, I think she was the local teacher, came out of the neighbouring house. She made us understand that the soldier would die within a short time, so why torture him? She promised to stay with him to the end, and she would see to it that he was buried in the town's cemetery. When we left, quite distressed, she was sitting on the ground with the boy's head in her lap. By the end of September, our division was deployed around Gerardmer. Our opponents were the US 3rd and 36th Infantry Divisions, both of which were fully motorized and equipped with tanks. But shortly thereafter, my regiment was moved back to the area of Le Thillot, not far from where we had been just a short time before. There, my future opponent, the 3rd Algerian Infantry Division, had just crossed the Moselle and approached the Cornimont-Remiremont road. Because Oberstleutnant Gumbel had to take command of a division group, or provisional division to which we were subsequently attached, the leadership of the regiment was passed on to me. This was an honour I probably would not have received if my older and honourable colleague, Dr. Major, had not been crossing the Atlantic as a wounded prisoner. As regimental commander, I still took a direct part in the infantry battle. While we were moving northwest through the wooded hills north of Ramonchamp to link up with another unit, I noticed a soldier who was in the bushes ahead of me, aiming his weapon at me. I immediately fired my whole magazine in his direction. With one more leap, I stood next to him. He was a very young officer, not Algerian or Moroccan, but a blonde Frenchman. I had hit him in his thigh, close to his torso, and I saw right away that any help would be too late. He still managed to ask me for his morphine needle, which every American and therefore French first aid kit contained. I stayed with him for a few moments and tried to give him some encouragement, but then I had to go on. In more than 4 years of war, our souls became calloused, although without this protection, we probably could not have endured so much. The more deeply we moved into the thick forest, the more dispersed our lines became, because we had to secure our western flank at least scantily. Yet, in the end, I had to give up. With barely 150 men, one could not mop up an extremely clever opponent, presumably superior in numbers, in 5 to 6 kilometers of thick forest. We also had an uneasy feeling that the Algerians or Moroccans had already passed us in the north, and that it was only a flank guard that we were fighting. This feeling would become an extremely unpleasant reality by the evening. It was, therefore, not feasible to advance any further. It also appeared to me to be extremely risky to leave my thin line of defence in this dense forest during the night. My aide-de-camp and I noticed at dusk how clever and dangerous the opponent was. For some time there had been total silence, and we had a short exchange of thoughts as we were standing in a clearing. Suddenly, a shot was fired, and a messenger who had come with us stood for a second as if frozen, then fell to the ground. Upon my rather frightened call, "Fiege, what's the matter?" he answered in clearly understandable words, "I am dead, Herr Majori." Seconds later, that's what he really was. One could move only with the most extreme caution. Comrades carried the dead back as usual, wrapped in his ground sheet. During the long war, I had experienced many things, but a messenger reporting his own death was one of the more macabre. Shortly before complete darkness, I ordered to pull back and only kept outposts on the clear hills outside the woods, facing north and northwest. A patrol confirmed our concerns from late afternoon. The opponent had practically encircled us. Some houses were in flames in Ramonchamp, situated some 500 to 1,000 metres south of us in the valley. One could clearly hear the bustle of vehicles and voices in the clear night. We were surrounded. After my return to the command post, I heard the rattle of shovels in the dark. When I questioned what they were doing there, they answered, "We're digging a hole for Fiege." Exhausted and depressed as I was, I just could not control myself anymore and yelled, "This is not a hole, you idiots, this is a gravel." Right away, I regretted my outburst, since the poor guys were at least as depressed and worn out as I was. Their irreverent expression was only a kind of cover for their stress. This nocturnal episode was always one of those especially deep impressions I had of the war. Some years ago, when I was back in Le Thillot, I couldn't find exactly where my command post had been, high over Ramonchamp. The dead that we buried there had been reinterred elsewhere in Alsace long before my visit. After my return, my adjutant of that time, Oberleutnant Albert, reported that we had lost telephonic contact with the task force, but I had expected that anyway. That's one of the problems with being surrounded. Fortunately, we were located high in the hills, and we were able to maintain radio communications. I asked for permission from the commander of the 338th Infantry Division, to which group Gimbel was attached, to take the regiment back to Le Thillot. I was allowed to do so, with the stipulation that I might take back the left wing, but had to leave the right in its current place. In reality, this would have meant that half the regiment had to stay encircled by the opponent. No further radio messages were answered by division after that. Here I would like to quote excerpts by the often-mentioned Herr Grazer, known for writing the history of our division. Now Grenadier Regiment 308 finds itself in a very peculiar situation. It is asking permission to pull back to its old position, but the 338th Division allows only a retreat of half of the regimental wing. At about 11 o'clock at night, hours after no more radio messages from the regiment were answered, the regimental commander decides to order a breakout to Le Thillot, simply on his own. It was true, too. First, I held something like a war council with my officers. Without any voices of opposition, we agreed that only now in the dark would we have a last chance to smuggle ourselves out of this fix, so I ordered a pull-out against the division commander's orders. I later discovered that I did exactly what they secretly hoped for and expected me to do. Since we could not use any roads, we had to leave some vehicles behind, but we took all weapons and horses and got them back to Le Thillot safely. We avoided any unnecessary noise. There was absolutely no talking allowed. We marched in a long column through the brush until we reached National Route 66, which was clear of the enemy, just short of the town. From the town's entrance, we soon heard the somewhat timid call, "Stop! Who's there?" My answer, "Gross Johann, 308, was followed by a loud and clear, "Thank God, Grandjean, that you're back." As it turns out, Oberstleutnant Gumbel could not allow my breakout. He was, to a certain extent, bound by the directives of the 338th Infantry Division. Now his relief and joy were tremendous. This illustrates a peculiar phenomenon that I believe was prevalent in the German army during this time. Many times before and after that, I found that superior commanders at the division level and above modified clear orders, or were forced to broadly interpret them. This was because while good news, such as the success of our advance that morning, was immediately passed with great fanfare to higher headquarters, less encouraging information such as requests to withdraw were greeted with pure hysteria. Consequently, generals usually left it to insignificant small fry, like maybe regimental commanders, to make the truly sensible decisions on the spot. Any commander who had not gotten the idea by now, and who literally interpreted his orders, was simply beyond help. So in this case, when he was briefed in the morning, the commanding general of the 338th Infantry Division would learn that Grenadier Regiment 308 had withdrawn from Le Thillot. It would be a fait accompli. He would, in turn, pass it up to 4th Luftwaffe Field Corps headquarters, whence it would go to 19th Army and finally Army Group G, all as part of a routine situation report, and they would do nothing about it. But if the commander of the 338th had asked permission for the withdrawal, there would have been hell to pay. Thus, a major who, in the teeth of heavy enemy opposition, got his unit knocked out of their position would, at worst, get bawled out. But generals were subject to demotion and relief for even asking to withdraw. As far as I know, that never happened to a 33-year-old major. As expected, nothing happened, and everything worked out for the best. My Oberst was happy, the commanding general of the 338th Infantry Division was content, and since the Chief of Staff of 4th Luftwaffe Field Corps was a close friend of my Oberst, he was satisfied as well. As later became obvious, the defence of Le Thillot, the approach to the Busang tunnel, was now secured for weeks to come. Today, the tunnel no longer exists. It was blown up in 1945. Now there is a wide road through the pass. Together with some other units, including Machine Gun Battalion 40, we formed a light but, as we soon realised, rather strong front opposed to our Algerian friends. I was named battle commander of German forces defending Le Thillot. Grazer explains the situation well. During the whole course of October, the French tried with repeated, tenacious attacks to break open the gate to the Busang Pass. They could not achieve any success worth mentioning. On the contrary, after they succeeded in pushing off parts of the 338th Infantry Division from the Menil Pass, they were again driven off this mountain in a counterattack by Grenadier Regiment 308. Ramonchamp, the village situated sharply northwest of Le Thillot, changed ownership more than 10 times in the weeks of battles, raging back and forth. Concerning the successful defence of Le Thillot, I believe Grenadier Regiment 308 contributed to it in a considerable, perhaps even decisive way. Referring to the recapture of the Menil Pass, the following has to be noted. The Col du Menil, at 621 metres elevation, is situated northeast of the little town of the same name, on the Le Thillot-Cornimont road. What was taken by battle was not this low-lying pass road, but the heights above it. In the context of the total events, this was certainly not an important matter, but it was played up in the daily Wehrmacht report, mentioning names and so on. I was personally honoured with a letter from the division commander. We became quite humble, as I said before, for every little success was used to make the Wehrmacht report appear less distressing, to avoid provoking an attack of madness from the highest warlord. Recently, I asked for a copy of the corresponding Army news report from the German Federal Archives at Kornelimünster, but it was not available there. Therefore, I have only our 19th Army newspaper article about the defence of the Menil Pass, written in somewhat bombastic style by the 19th Army Propaganda Company. The single true statement contained in it is that my adjutant and I were wounded by artillery fire. I had several small splinters pulled from my head. Some others were even removed years later. The days in Le Thillot were quite lively. My place as battle commander was in a downtown hotel, but my real command post was located in the west end of town, next to National Route 66. Both structures are still preserved without any change up to the time of this writing. A small wall, against which an assault gun that was temporarily under my command got stuck, still showed the ruts from the vehicle's attempts to get off the wall, as late as 1976. The main weapons that assured our successful defence were the twin-barrelled 20mm automatic cannon of Machine Gun Battalion 40. The town of Le Thillot is situated in a valley. For each attempt to advance toward it, the opponent had to climb down from the heights opposite, which fortunately were only covered with low brush. When the two double-barrelled flak weapons opened fire with their explosive bullets against an evident attack, the offensive spirit of the attacker expired quickly. My presence in the main battle line was almost always necessary, because artillery fire on both sides of the main road often caused panic with the young soldiers of this separate automatic weapons outfit. They would jump out of their foxholes and look for cover in the houses further behind the town. They suffered especially high losses each time, because the French artillery would fire extensively. Regrettably, the NCOs of this unit, which normally did not belong to our regiment, were no special heroes. The strong leadership necessary in battle was in short supply among them. Nevertheless, the Algerians did not have any success with us until the day of our relief. Apart from being responsible for the defence of the town, as battle commander, I also felt a certain accountability for the French civilian population, which understandably had no more ardent wish than to see us disappear eastward behind the crest of the Voges mountains. The mayor of Le Thillot, whose name, Georg Grosjean, coincidentally resembled mine, was a rational partner in any conversation about official issues. There were no language problems, especially since my aide-de-camp, having been chief dealer in a Baden-Baden casino, spoke excellent French. After the war, a little book titled Final Battle in the Vosges Mountains was published by Parbel Publishers. The author, W. Borchet, mentions the efforts of my successors in Le Thillot in evacuating the civilian population. Our successors were from the 269th Infantry Division, under the command of Generalleutnant Hans Wagner. The ally was Major Schwutke. At various times during subsequent fighting in Alsace, I served under Wagner, either directly or as commander of an attached unit. The story he related to me further illustrates the command climate during the fighting in the Vosges. By the time Wagner wanted to evacuate the town, our 19th Army had passed to the command of Army Group Oberrhein, which was personally commanded by the Reichsführer SS, Heinrich Himmler. In their efforts to spare the civilian populace in the vicinity of Le Thillot, both Wagner and Schwütke followed the unofficial rules. Upon asking General der Flieger Erich Petersen, commander of 4th Luftwaffe Field Corps, for permission to make contact with the French forces regarding evacuation of the civilian population, Wagner got a typical response. "I cannot and must not give my approval, Wagner," Petersen cried. "My God, don't you understand? I would have to make a written report to Himmler if I were to do this. Do you know what that means?" In matters like these, frontline soldiers simply had to work it out on their own. Himmler was sitting in his headquarters at Triberg. Why should one have to rub under his nose what one intends to do several hundred kilometers further west, namely to perform a simple humane act to protect endangered civilians? My division history reports that immediately after taking over my duties as battle commander, without asking anyone, I sent a French nurse on a bicycle to go and appeal to the French commander of our Algerian opponents to cease fire at certain times so that groceries could be delivered. During this time, we offered to refrain from any belligerent activity. I also offered to hand over the orphanage and the old folks' home on the main street. The nice nurse, executing her duties in her habit, came back with a positive answer, as expected. The ceasefire intervals were observed, and all military action was halted. I am sure that the French also adhered to the agreements on this point, but I was denied the means to transport the children and the elderly, including caretakers. I could not afford to allow the French to approach with a column of trucks, because word of this might have gotten all the way to Triberg. Upon assuming command in the area, General-Lieutenant Wagner decided to take all this a step further. Monsieur Grosjean, the mayor, gave him full support, and all parties agreed to uphold the tightest discretion. The evacuation of the citizenry of Le Thillot took place during a foggy night, not into the area behind the German troops as I had suggested, but more logically to the French side. Exactly 30 years later, for the first time in 1974, and for the second time in 1976, I paid a visit to the mayor of Le Thillot, accompanied by my family. Both times we were received in a very friendly manner. In 1980, the old gentleman died, in his 87th year. I considered it more than a gesture of pure courtesy when his family sent me an announcement of his death. The great majority of the French could certainly not complain about the conduct of the German soldiers in their country. One could not blame the Wehrmacht for the actions of certain party organizations, strongly supported by tens of thousands of collaborators. Yet, after 1945, the French ignored not only this, but also the fact that it was not us who declared war in 1939 on them, but they on us. In the spring of 1945 and after, the people of certain communities in Baden-Württemberg would have been very content had they received as much understanding and goodwill from some French commanders as, for example, the inhabitants of Le Thillot had enjoyed from us in the fall of 1944. In Le Thillot, we were apprised of the news that Generalfeldmarschall Erwin Rommel had succumbed to the serious wounds he had suffered from being strafed in Normandy the previous summer. The real circumstances were only made known after the war. This news report fit right into the depressing general situation of these days and weeks. Rommel was an unusually brave battlefield leader, full of surprises and determination. Considering the special conditions of the theatre of operations in Africa, he understood how to outmaneuver the apparently methodical and quite uninventive British generals. In his military undertakings, as well as in his private life, he had always been immensely lucky. Yet even he failed to prevent the Allied invasion on the Atlantic coast. Rommel had his shortcomings, though, and many of us did not share the cult of adulation to which many subscribed. He was inconsiderate not only of himself, being rather reckless on the battlefield, but also toward his subordinates. Without demonstrating any scruples, he was even known to take credit for his subordinates' successes. Few things endear a commander to his men less than this. During the 1940 campaign in France, his 7th Light Division took the highest losses of all divisions involved in the Western campaign, including infantry divisions. In view of some of these characteristics, it had to be difficult to see him as a sympathetic human being. His rocket-like ascent from Oberst to Generalfeldmarschall in less than 3 years' time. was the result not only of the relentless dedication of his troops and himself, but also of a wisely crafted program of self-promotion. It was certainly no accident that he finagled the assignment of several prominent members of the propaganda ministry to serve as reserve officers for his division in France, and later for the Africa Corps. As a person, Rommel was in many ways a typical Swabian, demonstrating the great spectrum of positive and negative cultural characteristics by which they are distinguished. It was not for no reason that Rommel had more enemies than friends, and being the Führer's favourite general made many envious. So when it became a matter of life or death for him, he found no friends. The 5 generals from the Court of Honour decided for his Swabian landsman Speidel, and therefore against him. In spite of his shortcomings, Rommel was nevertheless an absolutely exceptional field commander. The news of his death at that time was very bad for us, like so much other bad news. Beginning in November, after almost 6 weeks, my regiment was withdrawn from Le Thillot and reassigned to the control of the 198th Infantry Division. I was informed that the 4th Luftwaffe Corps commander, who was my superior during the time in Le Thillot, wanted me to sign out in person before I left his area of command. It was already past midnight after our relief when I arrived at Corps headquarters. I was told that the general had gone to sleep, but wanted to be awakened as soon as I got there. Shortly thereafter, he appeared fully dressed in his Luftwaffe uniform, not in his bathrobe, as I had expected. For almost 15 minutes, General de Vlieger-Petersen conversed with me and expressed his appreciation of our firm defence at Le Thillot. He had also arranged that I would receive a few hundred of those much-craved frontline ration packages for the soldiers of my parting regiment.